Michelle, who's been waiting patiently. Michelle, thank you so much for unmuting. And what's your question for Brenda?
Thank you, Brenda. It's amazing to see you again. I'm a huge fan. I have a question about probiotics for children. So I am a practicing nutritionist, and I'm wondering what you think when you're dealing with a child that has withstood prolonged and repeated antibiotic use, and they've got a very, very depleted microbiome, about the efficacy of probiotics, and the child will not tolerate or is not interested whatsoever in fermented foods of any kind. I've noticed that the research seems to be fairly unsupportive of probiotics in terms of efficacy, that it can be a supporting player. But I'm wondering, you look at this research so much more extensively than anyone I know. What have you found in that regard in terms of the effectiveness of probiotics to help that situation? Because I think focusing on food seems to be the most effective thing that I've found.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think you're right. You're spot on, Michelle. The evidence is still a little shaky on whether or not probiotics, how effective they are. And there's a lot of research showing that they can be effective if they are very carefully selected. And so there's certain bacteria that are very specific to certain types of conditions and situations that you need to be supplying in the supplement form. So and that I definitely don't have the expertise in that regard, but there are some really good books. There's one by Alan Desmond, and another of course Fiber Fueled, and that go through some of this in reasonable detail. But the other thing is, I think you're absolutely right that the most critical factor is providing the gut microbiome with sufficient prebiotics, and prebiotics are simply the food for the bacteria, and you need to have sufficient prebiotics in food, and then slowly the gut microbiome will start to rebuild itself in a positive direction. And so prebiotics, all plant foods contain prebiotics. Prebiotics are just different types of fiber, and one of the most important things is the diversity of the prebiotics. So you want to be including fiber-rich, a wide variety of fiber-rich foods for optimal results. But in the situation that you're talking about, based on what I've seen over the years, I would still think that a really high quality probiotic supplement could be a reasonable choice as well.
Brenda, thank you. And up next, we have, I believe, Artie, if I'm saying that correctly. Artie, if you'd go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Brenda. Thank you very much for your talk. Hi. Sorry, my video just gone up. Okay. I just want to thank you very much because you've been one of the biggest influences in my practice. I work as a family medicine doctor, and in terms of how I've changed things and approach my patients, I basically follow everything you advise and pass it on to my patients. And I've seen great benefits. So I really want to thank you for that.
Well, Artie, thank you. That means the world to me. I just so appreciate you sharing that, and I feel so honored. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. So my question was to extend towards kids. So my specialist area is type 2 diabetes, but I'm mainly seeing adults. As a family medicine doctor, I do see kids as well, though. So the question was about sort of the typical plant-based plate that we use for adults. I saw your picture up for the one that you use for kids as well, and it looks very similar. But in terms of limiting fat content, I do limit it to a certain degree that, they allowed a small proportion of fats that are high in omega-3, like whether it's walnuts or chia seeds or flax seeds. But in kids that are very young, because over here, I practice in Dubai, and over here we have a huge epidemic of obesity, type 2 diabetes, in fairly young children, to be honest. And it's quite sad to see. But in terms of sort of limiting fat proportion, I'm not entirely completely confident to limit it as much as I would in adults. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a really unfortunate to see what's happening in the Middle East with overweight, obesity, and chronic disease. It's just escalating, and it's sad to see it among children, particularly. And my feeling, if you look, it's so interesting if you look at the blue zones, because what you see is the Okinawans eating about 10% of calories from fat. And then you see the people from Ikaria, Greece, eating 50% of calories from fat. And in my experience, the health consequences have far less to do with the relative percentages of macronutrients, just so long as you're within a reasonable amount for protein and carbohydrate and fat. They have less to do with the relative percentages of those macronutrients than the sources of those macronutrients. So when fat comes from nuts and seeds and avocados and whole foods, it is consistently protective to health. When protein comes from plant foods like legumes and all of the plant foods you can think of, it is consistently protective to health. When carbohydrates, carbohydrates are often so maligned, or whatever you would call it. They've been blacklisted in so many people's books, but carbohydrates are not a problem at all. When they're unrefined, they are actually protective to health. It's when we strip everything of value away from them that they cause problems. So in an unrefined or whole food form, none of those macronutrients are an issue. And so to me, the important thing with children is to be providing them with a wide variety of whole plant foods that are excellent sources of fiber, that are not overly processed. And so these children who we see overweight and obesity in, the goal to me is not to take fat out of the diet. The goal is to take garbage out of the diet. It's to take the highly processed foods out. If they're plant-based, that's wonderful. If they're not, you want to be getting rid of, or at least minimizing intake of animal products, especially the processed animal products, the fast foods, fried foods, processed meats, so on. And those are the goals. Those are, getting rid of highly processed foods is the biggest issue for children who are overeating. Children don't usually overeat things like beans and whole grains and vegetables and fruits. And when they're getting these healthy foods, I talked a little bit about in the presentation why it's so important to have that division of responsibility, so that we're not shoving foods down their throat, and we say, when they say no, we respect that when they're full, and to help them to learn to really honor their bodies in terms of when they're feeling full and when they're hungry. And so these are all very important. And while we may not want to be necessarily pouring oil over their food if they're overweight, because it's so concentrated in calories, we definitely don't want to be withholding higher fat whole plant foods, because they need fat. Fat is, it's part of the cell membrane of every cell in the body, and it affects the fluidity and shape and flexibility of those cells and what they can let in and out, and it affects our brain function, our brain cells. It's a really important macronutrient, as is protein, as is carbohydrate. And so we don't want to look at fat as the sort of the evil villain where obesity is concerned. Overeating is the evil villain. And what causes overeating is when we mess up our appetite control center by eating these foods that are infused with fat and sugar and salt that are concentrated sources of those things that mess up our ability to know when to stop eating. And so that, to me, overeating happens when we're eating those kinds of heavily processed foods that are designed to hit that bliss point in individuals where you just can't stop eating, like potato chips. Those kinds of things are really hard to stop eating. And so it's best to not have them in the home. It's not, it's not something that you say, well, you never eat, but that you're 95% of the time what you're eating from one meal to the next excludes these really highly processed foods. And so, yeah, I mean, children still need probably, depending on the age, like I said, age 1, it's about 40% of calories from fat. By age 3, it's about 30%. And for older children, usually we look at 25 to 30% of calories from fat being very appropriate, even in those cases.